Okay, so we are recording. Okay, hey guys, welcome. This is the first ever interview that I am having on the Stono Rebellion, the Stono Griot. I have a very special guest with me here. It's a very special person as far as my work and my walk in the movement. A person who taught me a lot of lessons, like never put a table up against the wall. Uh, it is my honor to introduce you all here to Bob Zellner, ladies and gentlemen. Hey, Bob.
Hey,
So, Bob, how are you doing today?
I'm very well, DeMonte. We're here in Fairhope, Alabama. Sun is shining. We've got movement work to do, and the struggle continues.
Yes, definitely. And part of the inspiration for starting this podcast or starting this platform was to get the stories of our elders as well as the current perspective of organizers that's happening out there and document this as a popular historian. So this is my attempt of adding to this bit of movement. I was told a long time ago by Chairman Julian Bond from the NAACP that he was told by Jim Foreman to write it down, to write everything down.
Write it down. That's right.
So this is
Keep
my
a record.
attempt. Keep a record. So this is my attempt. So we'll start off. So Bob, you want to tell us about a little bit of where you grew up, L.A.
Yeah, well, DeMonte, as you know, I grew up in L.A., Lower Alabama, and it was very unlikely that I would ever get involved in the civil rights movement because my father was in the Ku Klux Klan, and my grandfather was in the Ku Klux Klan, and lots of my kinfolks. But I was very lucky because on my mother's side of the family, she comes from the Creek Indian Nation, the Apalachicola Band of Creek Indians. Her family was not at all Klan minded. They were opponents of the Ku Klux Klan. So basically, I've been born into this struggle between uh, the uh, the powers of progressive Christian living and the powers of the Ku Klux Klan. So, growing up in South Alabama, I was able to see the bad side of things as a child. And because my father was able to break from the Ku Klux Klan when he became a Methodist minister, I remember when Dad denounced the Ku Klux Klan, his father and mother disowned him, and his brothers never spoke to him again in his whole life. And as a young person, I didn't understand how devastating that could be. And the only thing I can compare it to today is if someone came out as an LGBTQ person and they were disowned by their own parents. So this is, uh, I was helped along the way very much by my father's example. That no matter how backward you may have been brought up, the American principles and the principles of the Christian religion have a way out. And if you listen to that and take a risk the same way the early Christians did, you can make a difference. So uh, I was very lucky that my father took this huge step. Uh, and of course, he learned about American racism basically by going to Europe right before the Second World War.
Right, right.
And my mother and dad, a lot of Southerners will know the significance of this. My mother and dad both were graduates of Bob Jones College, which became Bob Jones University. And in fact, I'm named after Bob Jones. He's my godfather. He performed the wedding ceremony for my mother and father. And so, growing up as graduates of Bob Jones College, you were supposed to dedicate your life to a very truncated and shrunken version of Christianity.
And for those that aren't kind of aware of Bob Jones, that are younger, that are listening, Bob Jones would be kind of like the equivalent of Liberty University today with Jerry Falwell. Um,
Yeah, that's right. Liberty in Virginia,
Lynchburg,
Jerry
Virginia.
Falwell. Yeah, and Bob Jones University now is located in Greenville, not Greenville, North Carolina, but Greenville, South Carolina, and still a hotbed not of Southern progressivism, but if you're a right wing politician, you stop at Liberty and you also stop at Bob Jones University. So, my father, being uh, a young preacher, went with Bob Jones to Europe in the middle 30s, about 1934, 1935. And they were missionaries. They were going to try to convert the Catholics in Europe and the Jews to be Christians. And so my father went there with Bob Jones, and after a month or so, Bob Jones and the other people from Bob Jones College came back to the United States, and my father was left to travel around Europe and go to little underground churches in Germany and Poland and parts of the Soviet Union. So he had to be underground. When he was in Germany, he had to dodge the Gestapo. When he was in Poland, he had to dodge Pilsudski's secret police. And of course, when he was in Russia, he had to stay out of the way of the KGB. So he was traveling around this circuit, and he was uh, meeting with a lot of Jewish people because some of them were converting to be Christians, and he was taking messages and money from one group of underground Jews to another, and he realized that if he was ever caught by any of these secret police, that it would probably be the end of his life. Um, and so something began to change with him. The Ku Klux Klan uh, preacher from Birmingham, Alabama, and he began to identify more with the Jews than he did with his own ideological soulmates, the fascists. And I remember as a small child when he's telling me these stories, eventually I said, well, I can understand how you would have a philosophical change in your head, but I said, something happened deeper for you. Something happened in your heart. And he said, yes, that's true. He said, after Bob Jones came back, he said, I'd been traveling in Russia in the dead of winter, traveling by horse-drawn sled with nothing but a driver and an interpreter, translator. And he said it had been so long since I'd seen anybody from the United States or seen anybody that spoke English. And he said our little tour of these underground churches, we joined up with a group of gospel singers from Alabama, and they were all people of color. They were all black people. And he said not only was it English, but it was Southern English, and it was so great to hear from anybody from home. And we were all talking about sliced tomatoes and okra and cornbread,
Yeah.
ham and grits, and we didn't have any of those things to eat. So he said it occurred to me that we liked the same food, We sang the same songs, we prayed the same prayers. And he said, one day I thought I was having a nervous breakdown because I forgot they were black. And he said it was very shocking because he said that's when his belief systems were coming absolutely head on in conflict. Uh, and he said, but it started happening so often. We got so close. I forgot they were black, and they forgot I was white. And he said it was really easy because the people in Europe just called us the Americans. And they didn't make a distinction between the
Right.
black Americans and the white Americans. We were all Americans. And Daddy said, I decided that I would just take a load off of my mind and forget about race while I was here. And when I got back to Birmingham, I'd be a good Klansman again. But he said that ruined me as a Klansman. So that started his process of what he referred to as wrestling with the angel. And eventually it brought him to break from the Ku Klux Klan. And when he broke with the Klan, he didn't just become a normal, moderate, middle of the road Southerner. He started working with Dr. King and Joe Lowry and the people that made the Montgomery bus boycott right here in the state of Alabama. And especially he's worked with a lot of Methodist ministers and ministers of other denominations who were listening to what Jesus was telling them and not what the Ku Klux Klan was telling them. So that began his work. So uh, by the time we moved from the small towns that he was serving all over South Alabama and Northwest Florida, uh, we moved to Mobile. Daddy had a church called the Broad Street Methodist Church in Mobile. And so I went to uh, Murphy High School, right across the bay from where I am now in Mobile. And that was, let's see, I probably started there in 1954 or 55. I was there for just my junior and senior year.
So, do you remember the significance of the event that happened on August the 28th, 1956, with Emmett Till?
Yes, I was very aware of Emmett Till because Mac Parker had just been lynched right across the Mississippi line in Poplarville. So we knew about that lynching. And when Emmett Till was lynched, many of us were quite young, and it was quite a revelation to many of us young people that racism was so powerful that even our parents could not protect us from it. So I felt that in a personal way. But also another thing happened in Alabama about 1955, and that was the first black student enrolled at the University of Alabama, Autherine Lucy.
Authoring Lucy, yes, sir.
Yeah, and so that was when I first became aware, a little surprisingly, because everybody in my high school was talking about Autherine Lucy going to the University of Alabama because many of them from Murphy High School were going to go to the University of Alabama. And they were complaining about Autherine Lucy destroying the university. And I would say, what do you mean she's destroying the university? And they said, well, you know what I'm talking about. And I said, no, I don't know. I think it's a good thing that Autherine Lucy could go to the University of Alabama. And they'd say, well, don't let anybody hear you say that. And I'd say, well, you heard me say that. And they'd say, yeah, but we know that you're odd and you're crazy. But people will hurt you if you say that. And that was a revelation to me that segregation was number one, it was quite fragile because they were so afraid that one black student could destroy all of the segregation, could destroy a whole way of life. But I also understood that it was so the movement was underway, and any kind of dissent was pounced upon. I mean, if you said that you thought it was a great idea for the University of Alabama to be integrated, you identified yourself as a dissident and as an enemy of the great majority of the people. So uh, out of that grew a small group of church young people, and we began to meet together. So that was my part of. I guess that was my first movement experience. Was a lot of the Methodist young people getting together, and we would meet after school and talk about the problem, which was now coming to uh, white hot heat in Alabama. And so most of us had been influenced by ministers like my father and other progressive ministers in Mobile and other parts of the Alabama West Florida Conference of the Methodist Church. And then
Well, according to the Secretary of State of Alabama, you were influenced by some Alabama communists, correct?
oh yeah, they were very concerned that the young people were falling under the influence of the communists. Uh, but at that time, we just knew that. I mean, we could tell that segregation was not according to the American way, and we certainly didn't consider it to be Christian. That somebody could be oppressed and persecuted and punished and violence be directed against them just because they were black, and especially because they tended to want some freedom. So we were beginning to see that it's going to be a struggle, and we want to be on the right side of that. So when I graduated in 1957, and I luckily went to our church school in Montgomery, Alabama, Huntington College.
Yes, sir.
And that's where I started Huntington in the fall of 1957. So I was there from 1957 till when I graduated in 1961. And that was immediately following the victory of the Montgomery bus boycott. So Montgomery and Alabama in general was the epicenter or ground zero, as they say, of the civil rights movement. So it was very easy for me as a sociology student then at Huntington to learn more about the civil rights struggle. And that's one reason as a senior then, I was taking a course in sociology in race relations. And you know, that was a very safe thing to do at Huntington College it was in 1959, I believe. It might have been my junior year. But everybody understood that this is academics. And if you are in a sociology course and you're studying race relations, the only place you're supposed to go is to the library and you read the books and so forth. So we did all that, and then we told our sociology professor, Arlie B. Davidson, that we were going to go, and we were assigned a paper as a kind of a thesis, senior paper, to write about the racial struggle and present ideas of solutions to the racial problem. Now, we figured that we were pretty well fixed to study that because the racial problem came from white people, didn't come from black people. So we undertook to do all the study in the library, and then we told our professor we were going to go and interview Dr. Martin Luther King and Mrs. Rosa Parks and Mr. E.D. Nixon,
Hmm.
who made the Montgomery bus boycott. And he said, "Oh, you can't do that. You couldn't possibly do that." And we said, "Why not?" He said, "Because you'll be arrested." And we said, "You mean we can be arrested doing research for a college paper?" And I remember he said, "You don't know the first thing about race relations in Alabama in 1959." And we said, "That's why we're in your course, doctor. We want to learn about race relations." So, but anyway, he said, "You're forbidden to do that. You can't do that." But we all got together, five of us, and we said, well, we not only have the right to do that, we have the responsibility to do that under the discipline of the Methodist Church, that we were told by our church that we need to seek to make, welcome the stranger and take care of the people who were in prison and care for people that were needy and all those things. And we also knew that we were in a college, so academic freedom said that we can investigate this. And we
Right.
made it clear we weren't taking a position, we just wanted to learn about it.
Hmm.
So we felt we were on good terms
Now,
and
now at
good
this, now
land.
at this time, Bob, where was the safest bet for you to find Martin Luther King?
Well, we decided that we were going to go interview Dr. King, and we didn't know how to get in touch with him. And so we thought, well, he's right here in Montgomery, and he's in court all the time. So we just have to listen to the radio, read the newspaper, and if he's supposed to be in federal court, then that's neutral ground. So we should be able. This is a public building and open court, so we can go. So that's where we met him at the federal court building in Montgomery, because he was on trial along with a lot of the other people that had done the Montgomery bus boycott for libel, because they had put an ad in the New York Times asking for donations for the uh, Montgomery Improvement Association, which had been formed for the purpose of the bus boycott. So anyway, we met Dr. King in the hallway of the federal building, the five of us, and we introduced ourselves as students from Huntington College, and we were doing a paper on solutions to the racial problem, and we'd like very much to interview him. And we said, we understand that there's going to be a workshop at Reverend Abernathy's church, because every year they had a week-long series of mass meetings at night, and then culminating in a nonviolent workshop at the end of that week. And we said, we understand there's going to be a workshop at Reverend Abernathy's church where you are supposed to speak. And we understand there'll be some students there from SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so Dr. King said, well, you're very welcome to come to the meeting. But he said, I want you to know that you need to be prepared to be arrested. And so we said, oh my goodness, that's what our professor said. And he said, well, that's why he's a professor. He knows that if you come to an integrated meeting, you'll be breaking the segregation laws. And we said, well, we don't think we're going to get in trouble because we're just doing research for a paper. And he said, well, you come ahead then, and but you have to you may be in danger of being arrested. So anyway, we did go, and that was when I really got my movement marching orders of that day. And that was the day that I met, remember specifically meeting John Lewis, because he was conducting one of the nonviolent workshops. So that was one of the first nonviolent workshops I participated in. And we all, being good students, they had lots of different workshops. One was on communication, one was on the legal situation, one was on nonviolent direct action, and so forth. So we all went to different workshops, and then we could exchange information later. Uh, but at the end of the workshop, Dr. King was giving one of his inimitable sermons. It was the first sermon that I'd heard in person from Dr. King, and that was pretty heady stuff for just some little white boys from Huntington College. And so as soon as he stopped, finished his sermon, he came straight to where we were. All five of us were sitting under the balcony trying to be inconspicuous because the state police were there. They went to all the workshops and meetings and everything, and they had a tape recorder, and they recorded the whole thing. That was how constant the surveillance was. And he came up to us, and I thought with a little smile, he said, the church is surrounded. There's police out there and reporters, the press is out there. And the police have sent word that the five of you are going to be arrested. And I remember I said, well, Dr. King, we need to escape. And he kind of laughed and he said, well, you remember that little workshop we had that you might be arrested? And he said, this is probably what we need right here in Montgomery right now. And he said, you better believe we'll be right down to the jail to get you out. And I said, well, we need to try to escape because we don't want to appear to be demonstrating. And we don't want to get our parents in trouble. We don't want to get our school in trouble and so forth. We were far from revolutionaries at that time.
At that time.
So anyway, Dr. King said, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll go to the front of the church and I'll go out the front door, and Reverend Abernathy and Mrs. Parks can take you down to the basement, and there's a back door. So if the police all run around here and the press and everything, when I go out the front door, they'll keep watch, and they can let you out the back door and you can run for it. So that's basically the plan. So while we were waiting on Dr. King to go out the front door, Mrs. Parks, who was standing next to me, touched me on my elbow right here, my left elbow. I haven't washed that elbow since. And she said, Bob, when you students see something wrong, you're going to have to do something. You have to take some action. You can't study this forever. So, and she said, something's going to happen in front of you one of these days, and you're going to have to decide which side you're on because she said, not choosing is a choice. So she was giving us our marching orders like John Lewis did. And so that was my commission in the civil rights movement. And when St. Rosa Parks tells you you got to go do something, you better just go do it. So,
Do it.
yeah.
So I have a few names to ask you about just from this particular period. Do you remember much conversation with Fred Shuttlesworth around this time?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Fred Shuttlesworth became a very close friend. And, because the NAACP, they had a strong state conference in Alabama. But at one point, they were outlawed. The governor and the legislature in Alabama made it illegal for NAACP to function in Alabama. They closed them down.
Now, was that John Patterson?
Yeah, John Patterson.
Okay.
And so when when they did, the NAACP, not being SNCC, decided that they would comply with the order and they would appeal it in the court system. Well, Fred Shuttlesworth and Martin Luther King realized that you're not going to shut down the movement in Alabama for 2 or 3 years while it's going to go through the courts and then get back to work. So they formed the Alabama Committee for Human Rights, and Fred Shuttlesworth was the president of that. Dr. King had the Montgomery Improvement Association. So between Dr. King and Shuttlesworth, they carried on the movement in Alabama. And so that opening was given to them basically by the NAACP being outlawed. And so when the movement kept going now, the surveillance had to be even more intense. So one of the first things that happened to us, because when Dr. King did go out the front door and Mrs. Parks and Reverend Abernathy opened the door, we jumped out on the sidewalk and walked away from the church. We were able to get all the way back around to our car, went back to campus. So we got back to campus without being arrested. But then we were met by the whole administration because the police had called the president of the college and given them all of our names and said that we had violated the law and we were being hunted by the police. And so they all said that we had to resign. The 5 of us had to resign. And then the president of the college made a statement in the newspaper the next morning that the 5 of us that had been at the workshop were hoodlums and troublemakers and not representative of Huntington College, and we're being asked to resign from school. And then, so the Klan burnt crosses around our dormitory that night. Mm-hmm. And then the next day we were called into the office of the Attorney General of the state of Alabama, McDonald Gallion. And he's the one that said, he puffed himself all up and he said, the 5 of us. And I was very lucky because my father, by this time, he was fully engaged in the civil rights movement as well, and he went with us to see the Attorney General. And the Attorney General said, well, apparently you boys have fallen under the communist influence. And I remember being pretty amazed, and somebody said, I said, or somebody else said, you mean they're communists in Alabama? He said, oh, no, but they come through here. And then my father said to the Attorney General, well, do you mind giving us some of the names of these communists so we can keep an eye open for them? And he said, well, certainly, Reverend, I'll give you the names of these communists that these boys have fallen under the influence of. And you need to watch out for these people. And if they contact you again, you tell me immediately. So we were all supposed to now be informers for the police. And so he said, Clifford and Virginia Durr, Aubrey Williams, Ann Braden, Carl Braden. He mentioned all of the people. Probably Glenn Smiley of Fellowship of Reconciliation. Mm-hmm. And so we took all these the names down. And shortly after that, I got a call on the phone in the dormitory, which we just had a phone booth, and somehow or another, Ann Braden got the number of the phone booth on my floor of the Massey dorm at Huntington College, and somebody answered the phone, and she said, "Is Bob Zellner there?" So they came to my room and they said, "There's a reporter on the phone that wants to talk to Bob Zellner." And I said, "Oh, okay." So I went to the phone, and a very sweet Southern voice said, Hello, Bob Zellner. This is Ann Braden. And I said in my mind, oh, now these communists are getting in touch with us. One of the communists. So I was very kind of eager to hear from the communists because I knew if the Attorney General and George Wallace and all of them and John Patterson, if they didn't like the communists, there must be something good about the communists. So she said, I want to talk to you about being asked to resign from college. And I said, well, how do you know about that? She said, I represent the Southern Patriot newspaper. And I said, the Southern Patriot. I said, that sounds right wing to me. Are y'all right wing people? And she said, oh no. She said, we're the opposite of right wing people.
Quite the opposite.
We're in favor of the movement, and we're very interested in what's happening to you students in Montgomery. And anyway, that's the way my relationship started with Ann Braden. And then a couple of days later, we got a letter. I got a letter in the mail, and it said it was from Clifford and Virginia Durr. And I said, oh, here are the other communists. And and all of them I talked to, I said, where are you from? And Ann Braden was from Anniston, Alabama. And when I got in touch with Clifford and Virginia Durr, I said, where are y'all from? They said, we're here in Montgomery. I said, well, the Attorney General said none of y'all lived in Alabama. You just come through here. She said, no, plenty of us live here. So that was the beginning of getting in touch with all of the people who had been working for years to make the civil rights movement occur.
So that leads me to ask you a couple of other names, just for the historical record. Bayard Rustin. Did you have much interaction with Bayard Rustin?
I didn't have a lot of personal interaction with Byron Rustin, but we all, especially in SNCC, we had high respect for Bayard Rustin, especially as an organizer. Uh, and by 1963, it was clear that he was an incredible organizer. So we were always very supportive and great admirers of Bayard Rustin. And also at that time, we knew absolutely nothing about the LGBTQ struggle. And but a lot of the SNCC people knew that struggle was part of the civil rights struggle, and that also happened to us at Huntington because one of our professors on the campus, there were very few professors or anybody else at Huntington in official positions that gave us any support. The Huntington Five, and the art teacher was one of our supporters, and he was arrested and charged with being a homosexual and banished from Montgomery. But mainly it was because he was an active member of the Alabama Human Relations Committee. So we had we were beginning to have experience with all of the parts that make up the broad civil rights movement of today.
Ella Baker.
Oh, Ella Baker. Well, she was the mother of SNCC, and in fact, if it hadn't been for Ella Baker, probably SNCC never would have really existed. But when the students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat in on February 1st, 1960, she was, I think at that time, she was the acting executive director of SCLC, Dr. King's organization in Atlanta. And she immediately recognized, especially the way it spread, because they had some students from Duke and UNC and so forth that began to participate in the in the sit-ins. One of whom was my older brother Jim, who had gone to Duke
Oh wow.
um, after he graduated from Huntingdon, the Methodist school. He went to Duke to get his doctorate, his divinity degree, and he participated in some of the early sit-ins. So I was getting the movement from all directions, from Daddy and from my older brother, and my students and all of my new friends in Montgomery. So I felt that I was slated somehow or another to play a part in this movement.
Another name, Diane Nash.
Diane Nash, yes. Well, Diane Nash was one of the main leaders of the Nashville uh, movement, along with John Lewis and um, Bernard Lafayette and Jim Bevel.
Bevel, right? Who they eventually married, right?
Yeah, they were married. Yep. And Diane happened to be in jail in Mississippi when she was pregnant with their first child, and everybody kept saying, "You got to get out of jail. You can't be pregnant and be in jail. Have that child while you're in jail." And she said, "This is going to be a black child, and it's going to be in jail wherever it is. When this child is born, this child will be in jail." So at that time, Diane Nash was in charge of the SNCC program, Move on Mississippi, Mom. So she said, "I'm a mom for Move on Mississippi, and I'm staying in jail. And this child, if it's born in jail, then it's a good start for this child." But Diane Nash was, well, she and John Lewis were the main leaders of the Nashville student movement. And the irony is that they were already in nonviolent direct action workshops with Jim
Jim
Lawson
Lawson, yes, sir.
in Nashville, and they wanted to be so prepared before they began that was one of the early lessons in the civil rights movement. The movement could start while you're getting ready. So one of the slogans was "Be ready, stay ready," and people would say, "Well, why should I be ready? Be ready for what?" Is it? And we'd say, "Because you don't want to have to get ready when it's time. Be ready."
Right.
So Stokely Carmichael later on said his one of his my slogans was "Ready for revolution." So whenever you're ready, if it breaks loose, you just go.
So 1961, SNCC, SNCC. Can you take me into that time period and what was your first introduction? The first time you got your feet wet with SNCC.
Oh yeah, well, SNCC by the fall of 1961, SNCC had metamorphosed very slowly from a coordinating committee to a staff run organization. So in the first, let's see, it was formed at Shaw University uh, in in 1960, April of 1960, and until the fall of 1961, it basically was a coordinating committee that each center of sit-in movements, lunch counters, and so forth, they would all send representatives to be on the SNCC executive committee. But by 1961, uh, the movement had taken off so fast, and so many people had come to SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and they had taken off a year, maybe 2 years, of their student studies to work full time. So by the fall of 1960, most of the important decisions of SNCC were made by the staff and no longer by the central committee of the coordinating committee. So that was when I graduated from Huntington in June of 1961, and the one of the things I did was I went. My first job out of college was at Highlander Folk School, and so being at Highlander Folk School.
Can you tell us a little bit about Highlander for those who don't know? Some of the famous graduates of Highlander,
Oh
um,
yeah.
and where it was, and sort of the story of Highlander, real quick.
Okay. Yeah. Highlander Folk School was located then in Mont Eagle, Tennessee, uh, right on the Cumberland Plateau, and it was organized by Jim Dombrowski, Don West, and Miles Horton, and they were all ministers of one kind or another, and most of them had been to theology school at uh, in New York at the New York uh, seminary, and they had decided that being Southerners, they wanted to come back south and after they got their degrees and do their work in the South, uh, helping poor people and moving the movement along. So Highlander Miles, in order to prepare to go to, they knew that they were going to form some kind of center in the South for doing especially labor organizing, which at that time was, and even today is basically the same as civil rights organizing, because labor in the South was separated and very weak because of segregation. And the big company owners and the rich people knew if they could keep the white people and the black people at each other's throats in the South, that they'd never be able to form strong labor unions and get better wages and better working conditions. So, in preparation for getting this center together, Miles Horton went to Denmark to study the folk schools. And the folk schools in Denmark was like continuing adult education. No matter what your education was before, that the folk schools were a way to continue working and getting education on whatever you happen to be working on. And the idea was that in a collective sense, if working people, common people, poor people get together and put their heads together, that they have enough combined knowledge just already in their group to solve almost any problem. So that was the foundation of the folk school idea. So when Miles Horton and Jim Dombrowski and Don West all graduated, they were able to get some people of means to give them enough contributions so that they could buy a piece of land in the South and organize this school that they had envisioned. And that was, they bought the land in Mont Eagle, Tennessee. And that was the first Highlander folk school. Um, so the summer after my graduation, I worked at Highlander. Um, and it was also interesting because uh, my family has been involved in and out of this of my whole uh, experience in the civil rights movement. But in the summer of 1961, Highlander had a summer-long program for high school students who were about to go into integrated schools in the fall. And Miles and other people at Highlander knew that there was almost no preparation being done to accomplish this school integration in the fall of 61. And part of it was that none of the school districts in the South intended, they just didn't intend to integrate or
Right.
desegregate. So
That was that all with all deliberate speed part of the Brown decision.
the Brown decision, yes, and that that hesitation gave the Southern monsters a chance to organize massive resistance. So that's what was happening in Little Rock in 1957, I believe. But anyway, my youngest brother, there were five of us boys. My youngest brother Malcolm was one of the summer students, and I was a counselor or teacher, and I also served as a lifeguard. I worked in the dining hall. I did just about at Highlander. Everybody did all the work that had to be done. So that was my summer of 1961. And one of the things that happened that summer was that Highlander had a series of workshops with people who were already active in the civil rights movement. So, and I had already met John Lewis and Dr. King and Mrs. Rosa Parks, and they had famously gone to Highlander Folk School right before the Montgomery bus boycott kicked off.
Sure.
And Rosa Parks was famously quoted in one of those workshops. She says, "You know, it's a great thing that people will get together and make a movement." But she said, in Montgomery, the black community is never going to get enough unity, and they won't stand together um, in order to make a movement. So she had no faith whatsoever that Montgomery, Alabama, would ever do anything significant in the civil rights movement. But she had the spark, and she had the spark even before she went to Highlander.
Hmm.
So that and she knew that E.D. Nixon and NAACP and so forth were looking for a good test case to test the segregation on the buses, which was particularly onerous to the black community in Montgomery because the majority of the riders of the bus were
Right.
black people. They
And
were they were what kept the bus company going.
I think this is a very important part also to note right here in the telling of this traditional story, is that there were women before Rosa, like Claudette Colvin and a couple of other young black women that were arrested on the bus. But it was because Rosa's involvement with the NAACP and her involvement as an organizer, um, that it was a different reaction. Um, to the other folks that had tried to resist on the bus before.
Yes, and she was a respectable middle class woman with a good job at the. She was a tailor actually, uh, and it always gripes me if you're a woman, you're a seamstress, and if you're a man, you're a tailor.
Right.
So, and her husband Parks was also a race man. He was already he was involved
The
in
Scottsboro boys, right?
the way back to the Scottsboro boys, and of course Mrs. Parks herself had been very courageous in investigating and getting uh, facts and testimony and so forth in rape cases around.
Like Reese Taylor. I think Reese Taylor might have been a name. I'm I should have had all of this like here. I knew I was going to ask you about Rosa.
Yeah,
So I knew I should have had all of the names, but I know Reese Taylor was specifically one of the names of women that were raped, and I think it was by the police, actually, right in Montgomery.
I think so. Yeah. And so Rosa Parks would go out into the rural areas and take the testimony and the affidavits and so forth of these rape victims. So she was extremely brave, and it was amazing how the legend of Rosa Parks was just tired from, just really exhausted from a day's work and just couldn't manage to get up from her seat. But she was already an activist. So, and that was made very clear to us when we met her through Virginia Durr and Clifford Durr, and in the movie that they made from my memoir, there's someone that plays Rosa Parks, and somebody plays Clifford Durr and Virginia Durr, and some of those scenes in the movie are basically from my memories of Virginia and Mrs. Rosa Parks telling me the stories about the early days of the Montgomery bus boycott. So a lot of that is in the movie that's coming up too. So we'll talk about that later if you want to.
Yes, sir, definitely. I guess this is a perfect time to talk kind of about the Freedom Rides and the events that happened in Macomb, Mississippi. Now I know there is a lot to talk about with the Freedom Rides. That is a very well documented moment in history. I kind of wanted to get your experience from what was happening with the Freedom Rides, and your involvement with the folks that was around, like Jim Swerg, and some of the other folks,
Yeah,
Peck, I think, some of the other folks that were involved, like particularly other white folks that were involved with you. Uh,
yeah,
and because I think we'll get to the names of the folks because the core involvement, and later on when the SNCC folks took over, that's very highly documented. But I wanted to like drill in this point because it was an extraordinary moment of courage at that time. And it's very similar to folks that may be watching this that are allies in the struggle for this movement for Black lives that is currently happening in this iteration, this current iteration. And these stories are necessary for folks to be able to reflect on. And like there were folks before you. So
yeah.
often in the Black community, we refer to our ancestors and our elders. And a lot of times, anti-racist white folks aren't taught about the Ann Bradens, the Miles Hortons, or the Al McShirleys, or the Bob Zellners. So this is that opportunity. So go
Yeah.
ahead.
Well, it is very interesting too that in terms of the freedom rides, very much the same as the bus boycott. Before Rosa Parks, there were many people who had refused to give up their seats on the bus as a protest and were arrested. And in a similar way, um, there were lots of freedom rides before the freedom rides actually kicked off too. And
Right, like the Fellowship of Reconciliation, right? I think that was
yes,
one with Byard actually. Bayard Rustin was one of these freedom riders, I think, maybe
yeah, in 1947 or something. So
47. Yes, sir.
long before the before the freedom rides in 1961, was it?
61, I believe so.
61 March. Yeah. But, you know, John Lewis tells a story about him and Bernard Lafayette being in Nashville in college. They took the bus back and forth all the time from Nashville down to Troy, Alabama. And the same bus went on south down to Tampa, where Bernard Lafayette lived. So in 19, well, I've forgotten what year it was, but uh, when the movement was really, really heating up after the sit in movement, after February 1st, the next time John Lewis and Bernard Lafayette were going to ride the bus from Nashville uh, down to Alabama and Florida, they decided they would take seats on the front seat of the bus. And they had no press, nobody even knew that they were doing that. And and every time they got to a major town that the bus had to make a stop at, the bus driver who had cussed them the whole time and said, I'm going to, threaten them with all kinds of stuff if they didn't get to the back of the bus. Every town they stopped at, the bus driver would storm off the bus, and the two of them said, we don't know if he's going to come back, and if he comes back, what he's going to come back with or who he's going to come back with. So going through all these little towns in Alabama, uh, they didn't know whether they would be dragged off the bus by the Ku Klux Klan and killed. And then when they finally did get to Troy, um, John said to Bernard, said, well, it might be a good idea for you to kind of ease on back to the back of the bus because you're going to be by yourself.
Yourself, yeah.
You got to make it from here down to Tampa without getting killed. And Bernard said, no, it's worked out all right so far. I'm going to stay on the front. So Bernard Lafayette stayed right on the front until they got to Tampa. So that was a successful freedom ride, at least in terms of sitting on the front of the bus, uh, long before the official freedom ride. But it was very instructive that when Congress of Racial Equality decided to um, repeat the freedom ride, one of the reasons they did that was that there was a ruling by the let's see, um, Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, that segregation was no longer legal in bus stations.
Was this Boynton v. Virginia?
Yeah, and that comes out of Alabama too, out of Selma, Amelia Boynton's family. Uh, so anyway, um, when CORE asked for volunteers to go on the Freedom Ride, John Lewis was one of the first people that signed up. He says, this is the kind of thing we've been looking for to happen in the South, so I'm going to go do that. And he was not only went on the first Freedom Ride and met the first violence in South Carolina, I think, and
Rock Hill, right?
Rock Hill, South Carolina, yeah. And John was beaten up, and then later on, that person that beat him up apologized to John, and that was all on the Oprah, on the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Ride, I think, on the Oprah show. But anyway, so John was on that, and the first bus was stopped in Anniston, Alabama. The tires were shot out. The windows were busted in the bus, and they threw gasoline bombs through the windows and set the bus on fire. And then the mob had followed the bus, and they tried to hold the door shut so that everybody on the bus would be killed. And everybody on the bus, everybody on the bus wasn't a freedom rider. So this mob was willing to kill a whole bunch of innocent people just to kill the freedom riders. And I think it was it might, I think it was a policeman actually, and this has not been reported widely, I think, who managed to get the bus door open enough so that he got his pistol out the door and fired in the air, and everybody moved back from the bus. So he was able to get the door open, and people were able to get off the bus before they were killed by the fumes and the fire on the bus. And then the other bus, the Trailways bus, got it all the way to Birmingham, and that's when Bull Connor had arranged with the Ku Klux Klan to give him 15 minutes. And he said, I can guarantee you there won't be any policemen around for 15 minutes, and you can kill or beat up or whatever you want to do, as many freedom riders as you can in that amount of time. And then you've got to fade away, and we'll show up. So that's what happened in Birmingham. And Jim Peck and the other people in the burned bus, they were so injured and beaten and weary by that time that they decided they would have to abandon the Freedom Ride. They wouldn't go on to Montgomery and then to Jackson and then to New Orleans. And Diane Nash and John Lewis and the students from Nashville were the ones that took up the ride then on the theory, a very good theory, but one that you would have to bet your life on, and that was that if the Freedom Ride was successfully stopped by violence, by the Ku Klux Klan and the Nazis and so forth, then it was going to be impossible to make any change in the South. So Diane Nash and John Lewis, and Bernard Lafayette, and a lot of the unknown people from there too. Angie Butler. Uh, they said we've got to write our wills, and we've got to go to Birmingham and go to the bus station and wait until we get a bus to Montgomery, and then from there to Jackson. Uh, so that was incredibly inspiring to, I'm sure it was inspiring to young African American women and men, but it was terribly inspiring to white Southern youth as well, that people were so uh, determined and dedicated to democratic principles that they would give up their life for the right to ride on the front of a bus or use a restaurant, a segregated restaurant. They were willing to give up their life for that. So a lot of people decided that if they can do that, at least I can do something. So uh, that was a small surge of support that's very much like what's happened in the Black Lives Matter movement since George Floyd's death. A huge number, uh, unprecedented numbers of white people, especially white Southerners, are coming to the conclusion that they've got to get involved to try uh, to solve this problem before it destroys our country. And so here in Fairhope, Alabama, and in Mobile, there's a tremendous turnout now of white Southerners, people carrying signs like "White People for Black Justice." I mean, those are things that we've been working for so long, and it seems like it's so deep now uh, in our body politic that maybe we're going to succeed. So this is where our country is right now. It looks like we're about to lose our democracy completely, and at the same time, it looks like we're finally going to have a democracy. So this is the conflict that you're covering, and thank you for doing that.
Oh, thank you so much for being on here with us. So that Macomb, Mississippi. I want to specifically ask you about this because there's a very famous movie that was pivotal in my upbringing as a child called Freedom Song. And if I'm correct, part of that movie is actually based on your life and your activities in Macomb, Mississippi, in 1961. Can you tell us a little bit about what was happening, the student walkout, just some of the events that happened there in Macomb?
Yeah, well, that movie was made by uh, Robinson, who is a fine movie maker. He's the one that made the movie Field of Dreams, and that movie Freedom Song was made in North Carolina at Wilmington,
Oh
North
wow.
Carolina,
Okay.
in the studios there. Um, and it was basically about the early SNCC, the early SNCC movement. And they did such a good job on that movie that they assembled a cast of young actors, and many of them, at first, all of the actors were playing. They were all playing actual people, and at first they started out using the names of the people, and then they wound up not using the names of the SNCC people, but they did use names of people like Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy and so forth. Um,
I
but
think one of the characters was supposed to be Bob Moses, but they gave him the name Daniel, and I guess they switched up for being a math teacher in Baltimore to a French teacher in Chicago. Like sort
yeah,
of those details, but if you know the story of the individual people in SNCC, you know exactly who they're talking about.
oh yeah, yeah, and Chuck McDew. They even had mostly they had actors that looked like the young Bob Moses or the young Chuck McDew and so forth. Uh,
Even the actor that played you, there was a specific part when I guess they're walking towards the courthouse, and one of the kid is like, so what has you involved? Like, where are you from? Like, why are you even here? And your actor goes Lower Alabama, and
yeah, well, yeah, yeah, they used my chapter from my book, The Wrong Side of Murder Creek. They used my Macomb, Mississippi chapter for the beginning of the script that they wrote. So a lot of it was the way that I remembered it, and I remember the scene where the young actor that's playing me is walking along in this demonstration. Well, I probably started at the beginning to set up how the demonstration, but there were about 135 uh, students from Berglund High School and maybe a half a dozen SNCC staff that were involved in the march, and I was the only white person there. So part of the scene is that we're walking up to the city hall in Macomb, Mississippi, and we're surrounded by 400 screaming mob members, Ku Klux Klan and everybody else. People had uh, baseball bats and iron pipes, and you can't imagine all the weapons, chains. They had all kinds of stuff that could kill you. And we're walking up to the courthouse, and on the top of the courthouse, you see some white men up there, and they're dangling hangman's ropes over the edge of the roof. And the the black student that I'm walking next to, looks up at the hangman's nooses and everything, and looks back at me, and he says, "You're white, aren't you?" I said, "Yeah, I guess so." He said, "You are one crazy white person."
Yes.
I said, "Well, you're here too." He said, so that was part of the movie. The way the Macomb thing happened was Macomb uh, on October the 4th, 1961. This is after the Freedom Ride has gone to Birmingham and has finally gotten to Montgomery, and now it's gone on to Jackson. And people have been in Parchman Prison in Mississippi, and
Parchment Prison, which is the place where John Lewis was famously he had refused to pay the bail. I think he had been convicted, right? And he chose to work the 60 days in the work camp, or the 30 days or 60 days over at Parchment Prison.
yeah, yeah, and the strategy of the Freedom Ride, once it was picked up by SNCC and carried on to Jackson, Mississippi, was to fill up the jails. And Mississippi said, "Well, we got plenty of room up at Parchman Prison, so bring them on." And I think about 600 students and people eventually wound up at Parchman, which was very important for the history of this civil rights movement because a lot of the people that went on the Freedom Ride and wound up at Parchman had already been participating in the civil rights movement. But it was Parchman Prison that that really put them through the fire and hardened them as organizers.
If
That
I'm
were
not mistaken, this is I think where John Lewis said that he was cellmates with a young Stokely Carmichael at this time.
Yeah, they were probably soulmates there, cellmates and soulmates, and then became a parting of the ways later on. But the important thing about the um, Macomb uh, situation, well, there were several. It was the first high school led march, mass march in Mississippi and probably throughout the South of the civil rights movement. So Brenda Travis was 16 years old, and Hollis Watkins and Curtis Hayes and so forth. They were all the youth leaders of this movement. It was very ironic also that the day after that march and that tremendous violence of that day, there was an article in the New York Times on the front page of the New York Times the next day. It was only about maybe 5 or 6 inches on the front page, but it said it talked about the demonstration in Macomb, and it said apparently it was led by Bob Zellner, white field secretary of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and that was very telling too because reporters and everybody else thought that well, if there was this white guy there, so he must have been the one that instigated the whole thing. He must have been the main leader and the main organizer. And I was the least experienced person there.
Yes.
Brenda Travis had already been arrested 3 times or so on freedom ride attempts, and I was that was my first demonstration. And when it looked like they were going to kill me that day, I kept thinking these people are overreacting. This is my first demonstration, and it's going to be my last. So I was thinking this is going to be the shortest civil rights career ever attempted. But right now I'm 81 years old, and I'm still ticking. But that's what SNCC people do. Just keep on going, and that's what John Lewis said: keep on keeping on.
So, what do you think it was that inspired Bob Moses to really seek out going to places that would be thought of as being the most dangerous of the dangerous places?
Well, I'm not sure that he sought out specifically most dangerous places. He wound up going to the most dangerous places.
Okay, yeah,
Uh,
that's fair.
yeah. But part of the reason that he wound up in those places was that, um, and this is a lesson to maybe for Black Lives Matter and other young people. What Bob Moses did when he first went to Mississippi was he did research. He said, where are the older people in Mississippi who have been providing leadership and have been putting their lives on the line? And he started with Amzie Moore up in the Delta in Cleveland. I've forgotten exactly where Amzie was from, but he started with Amzie Moore, who, interestingly enough, was worked for the federal government as a uh, postal worker. He either delivered mail or worked at the post office somehow or another, and the reason and because he was hired by the federal government, he couldn't be fired by the slave owning uh, plantation owners of Mississippi. So Amzie Moore he had to risk his life all the time, but they couldn't, uh, they couldn't fire him or keep him from making a livelihood. So that's where Bob Moses went. And one of the reasons he knew all of these people and had contacts with them was because Ella Baker had worked for so long for the NAACP in the South, and then later for Dr. King's organization, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So she told Bob Moses, you start out by going to see Amzie Moore because he knows everybody in the state who is in the NAACP or who has put their life on the line. And from there, he got in touch with Medgar Evers, Steptoe, um, all of the leaders that had gone before. And that's one of the lessons for Black Lives Matter and the young people now. I know you don't want to hear from old people, but old people do have some interesting knowledge that might help in this struggle. SNCC was the original Black Lives Matter group, and nobody in SNCC wanted to hear from anybody that was old because we said, well, if
Don't
they were
trust
so
people over
good,
30, right?
but
Is that the don't trust people over 30?
that became a total slogan of all the youth movement, even SDS and everything. Don't trust anybody over 30. Um, well, maybe you don't trust them, but you can learn from them anyway. Trust but verify. So anyway, that was what Bob Moses was doing in Mississippi. And Amzie Moore said, Bob, at this point right now, we're not able to do a voter registration campaign. But he said, I have some friends down in Macomb, in Pike County, Macomb, Mississippi, and they've been looking for some help to do a voter registration down there in Amite County and Pike County. And he said it's a very bad place because the Klan is very strong in especially southeast Mississippi, and they're very dangerous and brutal.
And if anybody that is watching that don't know the traditional geographical like divide of Mississippi, West Mississippi is usually where you'll find the blacker areas like Jackson. That's in West Mississippi, and White Mississippi is more traditionally white. Right? Is that what how you would describe it?
Yeah, and especially the Ku Klux Klan has always been very strong in right next to state lines. So if you can have three states that come together and right in that area, Louisiana, Mississippi, and maybe Arkansas, there was a two or three state borders right there. And one of the reasons the Klan has always liked to be strong in those areas is that if the Ku Klux Klan needs some killing to be done in Louisiana, they'll get somebody from Arkansas to come over and do it, or Mississippi and come over and do it, and vice versa, so that they can always flee back to their home state. And the state police and the FBI and so forth can kind of brush their hands and say, well, we did the best we could, but they made it across the state line, and
Right.
we weren't able to pursue them, and we never found out who they were. So having that was an extremely dangerous area down there. But anyway, there were people there like Herbert Lee.
Mm-hmm.
Many of them had been veterans in the Second World War and in the Korean War, which we were fighting to protect democratic rights. And then they came back to Mississippi and they weren't allowed to vote. So a lot of these, Medgar Evers was one that said, if we can fight for our freedom and risk our lives in Europe or in Asia or something, when we come back, by golly, we're going to register and we're going to vote. So that was what started happening. And so one of the first people in Pike County in that area to go down to register to vote, attempt to register to vote, was Herbert Lee. And when he attempted to register to vote, of course, one of the things they did was they would always publicize your name and your address, where to find you. And so um, the next day or a couple of days later, uh, Herbert Lee was taking some cotton to the gin in Liberty, Mississippi, and his next door neighbor, E.H. Hurst, who was a white member of the Mississippi State Legislature, followed Herbert Lee to the cotton gin and confronted him about going down to register to vote and shot him one time in the head, killing him instantly. And that was why SNCC decided that their very first staff meeting would be in Macomb, Mississippi, because SNCC said, we're not going to be meeting in Atlanta or Nashville or New Orleans or some safe places if Bob Moses and some of our people are working with folks in very dangerous areas. That's where we'll go and have our meetings. So that's why we wound up in Macomb, Mississippi.
Okay. So that leads me over to, so let's say 1962 to 1963, these years. I know there was a very pivotal moment in August of 63 with the March on Washington. Can you take me back to your memories of this?
Yeah, in August of '63, uh, we had by 1963, with the new phase of the civil rights movement kicking off in Greensboro, North Carolina, in February of '60. February, and then 61, 62, 63. So by 63, by the first couple of months of 1963, we had already been 3 years into this high level of the civil rights movement. There'd been the lunch counter sit-ins, the freedom rides, voter registration, and by that time, it was, let's see, um, there was a movement among the movement people, especially A. Philip Randolph, who had tried to have a march on what. And the determination of the black community in America to go for full freedom now. And so there began to be the preparations for the March on Washington. Um, and so by that time, SNCC, because of the leadership of three well-known people, well, two well-known people and one hidden figure, SNCC had become the largest of the civil rights organizations. By that time, we had a staff of 150 or 200 people. We had a Sojourner motor fleet that had 150 vehicles. In Atlanta, we had a huge office with a full printing press and a full communications department run by Julian Bond. We had our own service station that did the mechanics on all of our cars. We had communications experts that had equipped the cars with the equivalent of cell phones, but in those days it was the CB radios. So we had established radio bases in most of the areas of the South where we were working hard. And Greenwood, Mississippi was the kind of the headquarters in Mississippi, and we had a radio base there. that saved many, many lives. So by the time of 1963, Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph, uh, planning the March on Washington, wanted to involve all of the major civil rights organizations, and that was the NAACP, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, uh, National Urban League, I think, and SNCC. So,
which was
uh,
called COFO for those watching. Um,
yeah, well, the coalition that we had formed in Mississippi was Council of Federated Organizations, COFO, and that was made up of most of those same organizations. And so that the March on Washington, every one of the civil rights organizations started mobilizing around that. And the idea was to have people come from all over the country, especially in the South, on buses to Washington, D.C. And that was what resulted in getting 250,000 people, which was a huge, huge demonstration at that time. Um, Buses coming from all over. And that's where we converged. And it was very interesting because one of the main concerns of the major organizers of the March on Washington was that they would be able to keep the reins on SNCC so that the whole thing wouldn't get out of hand and get too militant. So they made a rule that there would be no freedom singing. SNCC was not allowed to do freedom singing. And then the other rule was that we were not allowed to have uh, a speech that was written collectively by lots of people in SNCC that was too militant. So yeah, John Lewis was pressured, and Jim Foreman was pressured to kind of tone down John Lewis's speech. And it's very interesting, too, because John was the youngest speaker at the March on Washington, which has become known as the I Have a Dream speech march for, for Dr. King's address, I Have a
which is
Dream.
which is like so small of a part of what he was actually saying when he was starting with like the whirlwinds of revolt, and he's talking about the checks and the
The
insufficient
check, yeah,
funds.
a bad check was written to, yeah, and Dr. King was always, once they made him into Saint Martin Luther King, they always toned down his radicalism because Dr. King was very radical,
Mhm.
and
I think
so
Charlie Cobb had taught me a term. They called it the Santa Clausification of of Dr. King. That they turned Dr. King into Santa Claus.
yeah, the Santa Clausization, okay, and Saint Martin Luther King. So they paid attention to the nonviolence and everything, and also the soaring poetry a little bit of the soaring poetry of his oratory, and it's very instructive too that you can watch the film because when Dr. King finished speaking, everybody just went crazy, especially all the white bureaucrats and dignitaries that were behind Dr. King. They very enthusiastically applauded. But when John Lewis finished his speech, all of the white people that were sitting behind the speaker's thing, nobody, not a single white person that anybody can see, applauds
Wow.
or appears to be enthusiastic at all. The people of color, 250,000, I went crazy, went wild over John Lewis's speech, but not the white people. because John said, too little, too late. He spoke powerfully to John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson and said, "You guys are too little and too late."
I think a part of the original speech was what he said that next time that we come back to DC that it wouldn't be so peaceful, right? I think that was part of
Well,
like
he didn't say no. It wouldn't be so peaceful, but his rhetoric was so militant that he said, "We're going to march through the South like Sherman marched through the South."
that's right. That's what yeah.
Nonviolently, but he always followed it with nonviolently. But what they were hearing was that we're going to burn this place down, like Jim Foreman said in Montgomery at the end of the Selma March. He said, "If they won't let us sit at the table, we'll knock the effing legs off of the
Wow.
table." Yeah. So Snick was the militant voice at that. And then, of course, they, as you pointed out, they always overlooked the radical nature of Dr. King's speech. And it was, I believe, Mahalia Jackson that said to Martin, because people were kind of, getting weary, and she said, "Martin, tell them about the dream." And that was interesting too, because the first person that ever did that sermon was Prathia Hall, who was a young uh, woman who was a SNCC field secretary. And Dr. King had heard her preach. Her father was a famous preacher in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And Prathia Hall preached the I Have a Dream speech in Georgia. And Dr. King heard her sermon on I Have a Dream, and he asked her specifically, "Do you mind if I use that?" And she said, "Absolutely. We all got a dream. You got a dream. Go for it." So um, we're a little bit like the Irish. In SNCC, we always said most everything that was really, really great, you trace it back, it probably came from SNCC. So even the I Have a Dream speech came from SNCC.
Yeah, and most folks also when Dr. King first used it was over in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, before the March on Washington too. It was just
Yeah, he had done it a couple of times, and it was a little bit like Stokely Carmichael hearing the slogan "Black Power."
Mhm.
He said, "Hey, that sounds pretty good, Willie. Can I use that?" And uh, Willie said, "Yeah, you can use that." And he said that at the first time in a speech in Greenwood, Mississippi, I believe.
Was this the March Against Fear?
March Against Fear after James Meredith was shot. Yeah. And Stokely tried out the slogan "Black Power," and that was just like "I Have a Dream." It struck a chord.
Yes, which actually as I'm glad that you brought up Greenwood, Mississippi, because that was where I was going to take us next to. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience running everything over in Greenwood, Mississippi? I know that there was a time when you were the field secretary in charge while Stokely had went away to, I can't remember which specific city that Stokely had left to.
Tallahatchie County. He went down toward Emmett Till's um, lynching place. Yeah, that was the summer of '64, uh, and SNCC and the other civil rights organizations had formed COFO, the Council of Federated Organizations, to make a push on Mississippi, because the theory was that if we could break Mississippi and get black people to register to vote in Mississippi, we'd be able to break through everywhere in the South. And so we planned the Freedom Summer of 1964, and we recruited students from all over the United States, and many of them were um, we learned later, I learned later, that many of the students that came down in '64 were from uh, old time, well known civil rights families. So people like Peggy Damon Day and others came from families that had been involved for decades and centuries in the black struggle. And the other great group that came as volunteers to Mississippi in 1964 were sons and daughters of very powerful and wealthy people around the country. Many of them were sons and daughters of congressmen and senators and, uh, and very powerful and wealthy people. Um, so we had a training program in Oxford,
Hmm.
in Ohio, at Miami University. And the first week was planning to have all of the people who I think were going to work on voter registration. And the second week was going to be people that were going to be working on the freedom schools and other aspects uh, of the Freedom Summer. And it was at the end of the first week, um, Mickey Schwerner, who was from CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and James Chaney were going to head back to Mississippi, and Andrew
Goodman. Was that Goodman?
Andrew Goodman, yes, was a volunteer that was going to go down with them. So they left Miami. I mean, they left Oxford, Ohio, heading for Mississippi. And I guess, I don't know if it was on the way down, but the church outside of Philadelphia had been burned to the ground
is
because,
this Wesley Chapel? Is
yeah,
okay. So
Wesley Chapel, yeah, out from Philadelphia. And so their headquarters was in Meridian, Mississippi. And so as soon as they got back, they needed to go up to investigate the burning of the church, and that was uh, during the weekend between the two sessions of training, and they were following the SNCC protocol that if they didn't check in by a certain time, then they were assumed to be missing. So when the time came for them to call and check in, there was no call. So the people in the office in Meridian immediately called the FBI and called Bob Moses and the SNCC people in Oxford, Ohio, and said they're missing. They didn't call in. So there was a meeting immediately of all the SNCC staff in Oxford, and they said, we've got to get down there as soon as possible because our civil rights workers are missing, and most of the people in the black community are not going to give any information to the FBI or the Justice Department because it always gets back to the Ku Klux Klan and just gets more people killed. So we need to get Rita Schwerner down there as soon as possible to go there and talk to the people. And so there was a discussion about who could go with Rita. And knowing that it would probably take many, many days and that we would be traveling all over Mississippi, they knew that it was important to have a white person to go with Rita to Meridian. And so that's why I volunteered to do that. and Rita and I went down immediately to Meridian, and then very quickly we went up to Philadelphia. Uh, and that was the beginning of the summer of 1964 for me. And I was totally involved for 2 or 3 weeks with the investigating the disappearance of our civil rights workers and traveling with Rita from Philadelphia to Jackson, Mississippi to Washington, D.C. for a meeting with the president. And by the time of that was all done, uh, everything, Dottie, my wife Dottie, was set up in Greenwood, Mississippi, because the SNCC office, headquarters and everything was moved to Greenwood, Mississippi for the whole summer of 64. So once I got uh, finished traveling with Rita Schwerner and doing the investigation of the disappearance of our civil rights workers, it was natural for me to go to Greenwood. So I showed up in Greenwood with not very much to do, and Jim Foreman, the executive director, said, Bob, Stokely is gone most of the time. He's down there in Tallahatchie, and he's the project director. So we need somebody to be the temporary project director until we can find somebody more suitable. Would you do that? And I said, well, yes, whatever you need me to do. Uh, so I became what I thought would be the temporary project director in Greenwood, Mississippi for the summer of 64. And as things usually happened in SNCC, everybody was so busy that I pretty much uh, served in that capacity for the rest of the summer. And that was a very eventful summer with the McGee's and Silas and Jake and Clarence and all of that stuff.
So I think this is a perfect part to kind of. We only have 10 minutes left for the amount of time that I'm able to record.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a perfect time to this could be part one because we are lifelong friends, Bob, and this doesn't have to be our only conversation, so that we can
Yeah.
put, we can kind of put the bookmark here at and this there's still a lot of like stories and history from your life's work. We didn't even touch the American Indian movement.
Hello. What's that? Oh, what's that? Sweetheart. Hello. Okay. I didn't know. I didn't know how to stop that, but
Okay.
I saw.
Did you stop it?
So yeah, I saw the decline. So
Oh, okay.
I don't know. Somebody's calling you.
Well, they can wait. Okay.
Okay. Good.
Okay.
Are you doing okay? Are you all right?
Yeah, we're doing good. We're almost done.
Okay, good.
So, we didn't get a chance to touch really like Selma or the Shinnecock things happening up in the Hamptons, your work, and even with Pungo Hospital. So we still have a good bit of history to cover, but I feel like this is a good time to kind of start or to stop. This is the Freedom Summer, so this is a very important time. So we'll continue, I guess, but there are still some questions or just a couple of names that I real quick I want
Yeah.
to bring across you. You can give me your couple of words or like your fondest memories of these folks.
Yeah.
Okay, so first person, Septima Clark.
Oh, okay. Septima Clark was I got to work with her very early on because she was at Highlander Folk School when I graduated college in 1961 and spent the summer at Highlander. And she was she's one of the great leaders of the civil rights movement. And which reminds me that so many of the leaders of SNCC were strong women, and Septima Clark um, was right out of the um, eastern seaboard islands, and had been working for years and years to get the vote for black people. Uh, Worked with Esau Jenkins in the Sea Islands.
Yeah,
And,
these are personally my cultural heroes. My family's Gullah Geechee, so
oh, okay.
I, I've grown up like as a former teacher, just Septima Clark's like history to me, like very important. So I look and read and research as much as I possibly can about her.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And Armand Arbery is from that same area as well. So yeah, but it was amazing that the powers that be in Tennessee, when they got ready to destroy uh, that first great campus of Highlander Folk School in Monteagle, um, they charged Septima Clark with being a bootlegger. Uh, so,
oh wow.
and the basis of that was that for those people who wanted a cold beer every now and then, they could get one in the refrigerator there at the center at Highlander, but they were supposed to put a donation in the cigar box on top of the refrigerator. So when it was time to get another six pack of beer, there'd be enough money in there to get some more beer. And so they charged Septima Clark with selling alcohol without a license. She was bootlegging, and that's the way they justified confiscating the whole campus and wound up destroying Highlander Folk School. And everybody that knew Septima Clark always thought that it was tragic that such a saint a saintly person who had been a school teacher all her life, and all she was doing was wanting to teach people to read and write so they could pass these onerous um, voter requirements of the racist South. So it is amazing that that she was picked for that role.
Fannie Lou Hamer.
Oh, Mrs. Hamer. Mrs. Hamer was a good example of leadership from the grassroots, because one of the things that SNCC discovered very early on is that even at that time when there was so much repression, that you could do very little about uh, any kind of fight back. There were always people like Fannie Lou Hamer in the fields, in the cotton fields, who were brilliant. These are people who are geniuses of organization, of relationships with people, courage, not to speak of the courage that they had and the dedication. But Ms. Hamer was particularly well. I was particularly close to Mrs. Hamer because when we started the Grow Project at the end of the SNCC period, for me, we started Grow grassroots organizing work, which we also call Get Rid of Wallace. And the white people in SNCC were now supposed to go organize poor and white working class Southerners, which was quite a daunting uh, list of, I mean, that was a terrible thing to have to do because these were the people that had been shooting at us all along. Now we're supposed to go and try to organize them
Yeah.
and bring them into the movement. And Mrs. Hamer said, well, don't worry about it. I'll help you. And she said, we've got a lot of poor people up here in the Delta that are sending their kids to our Head Start program.
Mhm.
because they need what we have here in the Head Start program. And many of the mothers and fathers are working on, they work for Head Start now. They're cooks or various kinds of people that we need for the Head Start program. So she introduced us to Ike Traxler and people that were very, very poor people, white people in the Delta, that they needed what the movement had, and they needed that a lot more than they needed to uh, stay with their racism. And so, like Mrs. Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer was the one that when we started the Grow Project, we didn't know what kind of help we might have from the movement. They said, "We can help. Come on up to the Delta, and I'm going to introduce you to our poor white people." And they've all got kinfolks. They work in the chicken factories, and they work in the pulpwood and all kinds of things. And they're used to working with black people, and they're wonderful, wonderful people. So Ms. Hamer actually helped us in the Grow Project more than any other individual on the ground. So she was one of our main advisors and strategists of how to begin to organize white people.
So I have one more name and then an item. The last name is um, hold on, Otis Moss. I'm sorry, Otis Moss. Do you have much memory of Otis?
Reverend Otis Moss. I
The
think he was,
second.
yeah, I believe he was on the SCLC staff. But as the movement rocked on, the people who were the most militant and courageous of all these organizations, they kind of gravitated to SNCC, and we kind of gravitated to them. So that was my uh, experience with Moss, and so uh, eventually we the young people, we didn't really make too much distinction between whether you were mainly SNCC or SCLC or whatever. We were the ones that were out on the front line. So that's where he was.
And the last question for this particular conversation is the legendary, world's famous SNCC overalls. Uh,
Yeah, well, the SNCC overalls. Well, that started out as a very practical necessity, especially in Mississippi, because when even as relatively late as 1964, when we were going to do voter registration in Mississippi, uh, the black people and the white people that were doing that organizing had to blend in. So you couldn't come in with your white shirt and your tie, or your city clothes. And so everybody uh, had to get overalls. And the older they were and the more raggedy they were, uh, the safer you were. Because going into Mississippi, um, especially getting back on the plantations, um, if you had a jacket on or a white shirt or something, you were a standout. Somebody was going to find out what you were doing there. But if you were, especially if you were walking along the road or riding a mule or something and you had on your overalls and your old brogan, you just looked like somebody else from the local area. So that's the way it started out, and then it became the SNCC uniform. And Dr. King and Reverend Abernathy and others of SCLC, who were mostly preachers and would never be seen in public with overalls on, whenever there was time for a march, they had their overalls and they would put them on. That meant it's marching time.
So, Bob Zellner, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for this opportunity. There's so much I wanted to cover in this one that I didn't get a chance to, but there will be a next time. Um, I wanted to cover, like the Freedom Singers, the Bernice Reagan Johnsons, the Chuck Neblets,
Yeah.
you know,
Okay.
uh,
Well, we'll have time to do that, Demonte. Will anytime you want, even if it's just 10 minutes or whatever, you call me because we are hibernating in place here in Fairhope, Alabama, and we're doing a lot on Zoom and this kind of. So we're ready anytime you are.
thank you so much for this, Bob. Thank you, Pamela. I don't know if she can hear me, but thank you so much for helping with the scheduling of this.
Yeah.
This is fun. I definitely appreciative of this. I cannot wait for Son of the South to come in theaters, to come out in theaters. But have they talked much with you about how they're going to release this movie with the current pandemic? Or
Well, the one of the things that's happening in the South is that they're refurbishing some of the old drive-ins, and they're even setting up new drive-ins with a big screen in huge shopping malls and everything. So it's going to have uh, some theater release maybe in September. Right now, it's in the Cannes Film Festival market because this year the film festival was canceled. But Spike Lee and Barry Brown, who won a lot of acclaim last year with the Black Klansman, uh, they are going to be promoting this film. And we don't know exactly how it's going to be released. But there's a lot of interest in Europe now and what's happening on our political and racial front in the United States, and also in China and India. So we're expecting some kind of attention, some eyes on this movie, and it may be released on after a short release in theaters and drive-ins. It might be released to TV uh, within 2 or 3 weeks after its official premiere. So we're just getting ready for it. We're going to have a series of meetings online with Spike Lee and Barry Brown, myself, and people like Harry Belafonte and Shaka Foreman. Shaka is the son of Jim Foreman. He was in the movie playing his father, playing Jim Foreman.
oh wow.
So, and so we're looking forward to getting a lot of attention to the movie, and we hope a lot of young people will come. The movie was specifically targeted by the producers and the director and the executive director, Spike Lee, for young people, especially young women, because the women's parts in this movie, like in Snick, were very large. So hopefully it'll have a good audience.
Yes, sir. And that is I guess my time, that was my camera going off, but yeah, this is our time. Thank you so much, Bob. I really
Okay,
appreciate this.
good. All right. Well,